don't see a lot of difference. To me, there's only so many notes and so many chords and so many ways to use them. And I like rock and roll. I like country. I like classical music. I like all kind of music. So I call it all rock and roll.
For more than 6 decades, Willie Nelson stood at the very heart of country music. His voice floated through smoke-filled honky-tonks, crossed dusty highways, and became a symbol of freedom, rebellion, and honesty. To millions, Willie was the gentle outlaw, the smiling elder who preached peace, forgiveness, and independence. He looked like a man who carried no grudges, but that image was never the full truth. Behind the braids and the calm tone was a witness to everything country music tried to hide. Willie watched friendships collapse under fame. He watched tradition traded for profit. He watched country turn its back on its own soul. And he remembered every moment. Late in life, with nothing left to prove and no one left to impress, Willie Nelson no longer felt the need to stay silent. These were not petty rivalries. These were not passing disagreements. They were deep fractures that formed inside the genre he loved more than anything. 6 names remained with him. 6 country stars who, in his eyes, crossed lines that should never have been crossed. Some did it for money, some for politics, some for ego, and some simply chose the wrong side of history. This is not a story about hate. It is a story about boundaries, and about the price of betraying what country music was meant to be. Number 6. Alan Jackson. Alan Jackson was never a scandal. That, in many ways, was the problem. From the outside, he looked like everything country music claimed to stand for. A traditional voice, simple melodies, songs about small towns, faith, work, and quiet pride. To the public, Alan Jackson felt safe, reliable, comforting, and Willie Nelson saw that too. He never questioned Alan's talent, nor his understanding of classic country structure. But respect is not the same as trust. As country music entered moments of deep tension, moments when it was being pulled toward profit, politics, and image control, Willie noticed who spoke up and who stayed silent. Alan Jackson consistently chose restraint. He avoided confrontation. He avoided taking sides. He avoided controversy. In an industry increasingly shaped by executives and marketing departments, that silence carried weight. To Willie Nelson, country music had never been about comfort. It was born from discomfort, from outsiders, drifters, rebels, and voices that refused to behave. When the genre needed artists to defend its soul, to resist being polished into something harmless, Willie believed silence was no longer neutral. Backstage conversations revealed the distance between them. Willie saw Alan as someone who benefited from the old traditions but refused to fight for them. Someone who carried the sound of country's past while refusing to protect its future. In Willie's eyes, that was not humility. It was caution disguised as integrity. The frustration was quiet but persistent. Willie did not explode. He did not attack publicly. Instead, the disappointment settled in. A sense that Alan Jackson represented a generation of stars who learned how to survive inside the system rather than challenge it. For Willie, survival had never been the goal. Truth was, there were moments when Alan spoke about tradition, about honoring the greats. Willie listened carefully. And every time, he noticed what was missing. No risk, no defiance, no willingness to stand alone if the industry turned hostile. That absence mattered. Willie Nelson did not hate Alan Jackson for what he did. He resented him for what he refused to do. In a genre built on standing against pressure, choosing safety felt like a quiet betrayal. Alan Jackson remained successful, respected, celebrated. But in Willie's personal ledger, he stood as a reminder that country music could lose its courage without ever losing its sound. And that, to Willie Nelson, was the most dangerous kind of loss. Number 5. Merle Haggard. There was a time when Willie Nelson and Merle Haggard stood on the same side of history. They were both outsiders, both bruised by life, both shaped by prisons, highways, and songs that did not ask for permission. Together, They embodied the outlaw spirit that pushed back against Nashville's polished formulas. To the public, they were brothers in rebellion, but brotherhood does not survive when values begin to drift. As the years passed, Willie watched Merle change. The music remained sharp, honest, and rooted in working-class pain, but the worldview behind it hardened. Merle Haggard began leaning toward a version of patriotism that felt rigid, defensive, and increasingly unforgiving. His lyrics and public statements shifted toward law, order, and authority. Willie, meanwhile, moved in the opposite direction, embracing anti-war activism, civil liberties, and skepticism toward power. At first, the difference felt manageable. Country music had always contained contradictions. But eventually, those contradictions turned personal. Conversations that once flowed easily became tense. Jokes stopped landing. Silence filled spaces that used to feel familiar. Willie did not object to Merle having opinions. What unsettled him was how those opinions reshaped the spirit they once shared. For Willie Nelson, outlaw country was never about waving flags or drawing lines between good Americans and bad ones. It was about questioning systems, protecting individual freedom, and giving voice to those pushed to the margins. Watching Merle embrace a more conservative identity felt like watching a rebel slowly align with the very forces they once resisted. The breaking point was not a single argument, but an accumulation. Statements in interviews, songs that carried a tone Willie could no longer recognize, moments when Merle seemed to speak for a version of country music Willie did not believe in. The disappointment ran deeper because of their shared past. This was not a rival from another camp. This was someone who once understood the same code. Willie never erased Merle Haggard from country history. He still acknowledged his brilliance, his honesty, and his impact. But privately, something had closed. The trust that they were fighting the same fight no longer existed. In Willie Nelson's mind, Merle Haggard did not betray country music by changing his sound. He betrayed it by changing what the outlaw spirit stood for. And that loss, coming from a former ally, cut far deeper than any attack from the outside. Number 3. Hank Williams, Jr. For Willie Nelson, the name Hank Williams was sacred. It represented the purest form of country music, songs carved from loneliness, addiction, faith, and fear, sung without protection or polish. Hank Williams Sr. was not just an influence, he was a foundation. Willie carried that legacy with reverence, treating it as something fragile that demanded respect. That was why watching Hank Williams Jr. build his own identity felt so deeply unsettling. At first, Willie understood the struggle. Living in the shadow of a legend is a burden few survive intact. Hank Jr. had every reason to rebel, to harden himself, to reject comparison. But as his career evolved, Willie sensed something darker taking shape. The rebellion was no longer about artistic independence. It became about provocation, confrontation, and domination of the spotlight. Public statements grew sharper. Political rhetoric replaced introspection. The music leaned toward aggression rather than vulnerability. To Willie, this was not evolution. It was distortion. The quiet sorrow that defined Hank Williams Sr. was being overwritten by volume, bravado, and spectacle. What troubled Willie most was not disagreement. Country music had always held room for opposing views. What disturbed him was the way Hank Jr. invoked his father's name while tearing away the values that made that name meaningful. The pain, humility, and honesty that once defined the Williams legacy felt buried beneath outrage and ego. Willie noticed how the industry reacted. Controversy fueled attention. Division sold records. Hank Jr. became a symbol, not of artistic truth, but of cultural warfare. Country music, once a refuge for the broken and the overlooked, was being pulled into a louder, harsher arena. And a sacred lineage was being used as armor. There was no single confrontation between Willie and Hank Jr. No explosive argument. The distance formed gradually, shaped by disappointment rather than fury. Willie did not feel challenged by Hank Jr. He felt saddened by him, saddened that a name born from vulnerability had become a weapon. To Willie Nelson, Honoring the past meant protecting its spirit, not exploiting its power. Hank Williams Jr. had every right to chart his own path. But in doing so, Willie believed he crossed a line. He transformed inheritance into branding, pain into posture, and legacy into leverage. The resentment Willie carried was quiet, but it was firm. Hank Williams Sr. had given country music a voice that whispered truths people were afraid to say aloud. Willie had devoted his life to preserving that honesty. Watching it reshaped into something unrecognizable felt like a personal loss. Hank Williams Jr. remained successful, influential, and fiercely defended by his audience. But in Willie Nelson's heart, he stood as a reminder that not all betrayals come from outsiders. Some come from those who inherit greatness and choose to remake it in their own image. Number 2. Toby Keith. The distance between Willie Nelson and Toby Keith was never subtle. It was ideological, emotional, and impossible to soften. Where Willie built his life around freedom, skepticism of power, and personal conscience, Toby Keith represented a version of country music that wrapped itself tightly around national pride and military symbolism. For Willie, that difference was not cosmetic. It cut to the core of what country music was supposed to stand for. The divide became unmistakable in the years following the attacks of September 11th. As the nation searched for meaning, country music became a battleground of emotion. Toby Keith stepped forward as the voice of anger and retaliation. His songs carried certainty, confrontation, and a willingness to draw clear lines between loyalty and betrayal. Audiences responded with thunderous approval. For many, Toby said what they wanted to hear. Willie listened and felt a deep unease. Having spent decades opposing war and questioning authority, Willie believed country music should offer reflection, not fuel for division. He had seen what blind certainty could do to individuals and nations alike. To him, patriotism was personal, quiet, and rooted in compassion, not volume. Watching Toby Keith turn country music into a rallying cry felt like watching the genre abandon its complexity. The tension spilled into public view. When Willie criticized the tone and intent of Toby's music, the backlash was immediate. Fans chose sides. Commentators framed it as a generational clash. Willie did not retreat. He believed silence would be a form of consent. To him, Toby Keith was not simply expressing pride. He was narrowing the emotional range of country music into something rigid and unforgiving. What made the conflict irreversible was not disagreement, but absolutism. Toby's worldview left no room for doubt, empathy, or dissent. Willie believed country music had always belonged to the uncertain, the restless, and the conflicted. Turning it into a banner for one vision of America erased too many voices. There was no reconciliation. No quiet understanding reached behind closed doors. Willie did not hate Toby Keith as a person. He rejected what Toby represented, a version of country that rewarded aggression over introspection, certainty over conscience. In Willie Nelson's eyes, Toby Keith embodied the moment when country music stopped asking questions and started delivering answers. And for an artist who built his entire life around questioning authority, that shift was unforgivable. Number 1. Garth Brooks. For Willie Nelson, this was the line that could never be uncrossed. Garth Brooks did not just change country music. In Willie's eyes, he rewrote its priorities. Stadiums replaced honky-tonks. Spectacle replaced intimacy. Numbers replaced meaning. What the industry celebrated as growth, Willie experienced as loss. Not gradual loss, but a sudden shift that altered the DNA of the genre he had spent his life defending. Willie never denied Garth Brooks's talent or discipline. He saw the work ethic, the ambition, and the intelligence behind the rise. But he also saw something else, something far more troubling. Country music was no longer being shaped by stories. It was being engineered for mass consumption. Emotional subtlety gave way to explosive choruses. Individual truth gave way to formulas that could be scaled, sold, and repeated. To Willie, country music was meant to sound like a conversation, not a performance designed to overwhelm. It was supposed to feel close enough to touch. Garth Brooks took it in the opposite direction. He turned country into an event, a product capable of filling arenas and dominating charts. And in doing so, he made authenticity optional. What hurt most was how willingly the industry followed. Executives embraced the model. Radio rewarded the sound. Younger artists copied the structure. Suddenly, success in country music was no longer measured by honesty, but by reach. Willie watched as the genre drifted away from its roots, not because it had to, but because it was profitable to do so. This was not a personal rivalry. Willie did not compete with Garth Brooks. He rejected what Garth represented. The moment country music began prioritizing spectacle over substance, Willie believed something sacred was being traded away. The genre no longer needed rebels. It needed brands. In interviews and quiet conversations, Willie's frustration surfaced. He spoke of country losing its soul, of songs being written for crowds rather than people. Those who listened closely understood exactly who he was talking about. Garth Brooks had become the symbol of a transformation Willie could not accept. There was no reconciliation because there was no misunderstanding. Garth Brooks stood for a future Willie did not want. A future where country music could thrive financially while forgetting where it came from. For Willie Nelson, that was not evolution. It was erasure. This was why Garth Brooks stood above all others on Willie's private list. Not because of ego, not because of fame, but because, in Willie's eyes, Garth Brooks marked the moment country music stopped belonging to its people and started belonging to the market. And that was something Willie Nelson could never forgive. Looking back, it would be easy to mistake this story for bitterness, to frame Willie Nelson as an aging legend angry at change. But that would miss the truth entirely. Willie never set out to judge individuals. He judged choices. He judged directions. And above all, he judged what happened to a genre that once gave voice to the restless, the broken, and the free. The 6 names on this list were not accidents. Each one represented a moment when country music stepped away from something essential: silence instead of courage. Discipline surrendered to chaos. Legacy reshaped into spectacle. Patriotism hardened into certainty. Tradition traded for mass appeal. None of these shifts happened overnight, and none were caused by a single person. But Willie remembered who stood where when the lines were crossed. What made his resentment enduring was not ego, but memory. Willie Nelson carried the early days of country music inside him. The small rooms, the risk, the refusal to fit in. To him, country was never supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be honest, and honesty always comes with consequences. In the end, Willie did not walk away from country music. He stayed. He kept playing. He kept singing. That, more than anything, revealed his character. He chose to remain inside the genre, even as it drifted away from him, because he believed someone had to remember what it once was. These were not enemies in the traditional sense. They were warnings. Each name marked a fork in the road where country music chose comfort, power, or profit over vulnerability. Willie Nelson simply refused to pretend those choices did not matter. And perhaps that is why his voice still carries weight today. Not because he was always right, but because he was never silent when it mattered most.